Hallo. Hey. I considered starting off in Norwegian, but I thought it would be confusing, so I just as well do it in English, as most of the rest of the evening will be in English as well. Welcome to KÅKÅ for this second night of intoxication and mayhem. I'm very pleased to inform you that some of our speakers tonight are on drugs as we speak. We'll just have to hope it doesn't descend into mindless violence, random acts of cruelty. But I hope that we will avoid that. I think we will have a very interesting evening. But before we start, I just want to remind you that tomorrow there's a brief interval. There's nothing on drugs here to give you the opportunity to go out and do them yourselves. But on Saturday, we're back and on Saturday, the topic is the use of cannabis for medical reasons. I think it also will be a very interesting evening, and I encourage you to come. I'd also like to remind you that although we don't have many books for sale here tonight, the authors are more than willing to direct you to the right place. And there is also some flyers here that you can use as a rabatt coupon to buy Lucas's book, which he will be talking of in a short while. But just to set the mood a little bit, I wanted to read something for you. It's from a book called Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. It's at the same time probably the most violent piece of literature that I've ever read, but also possibly the most beautiful. And to me, as all the great works of literature, it's open to interpretation, of course. But to me, this book very much is a meditation on the nature of war and the definitions of warfare. And Lukas mentioned yesterday in his remarks that you could regard war from different angles, to how the first angle would be possibly the existential angle, that war is something that is inherent to human nature. It's what we are. And you can see something of that in the so-called warrior cultures. The other one would be the expression where the acts of violence are some kind of reaction to some external thing. And the third would be the more instrumental warfare that we see now in modern time, where warfare is a very calculated and technologically driven activity. But just to start somewhere, this is quite a while into the book, and many terrible things have happened. And they have a brief interval in the fighting, and they sit around the fire discussing war. The good book says that he that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword, said the black man. The judge smiled, his face shining with grease. What right man would have it any other way, he said. Yet the good book does indeed count war as evil, said Irving. Yet there is many a bloody tale of war inside it. It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures, as well as ask men what they think of stone. War was always there. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be, that way and not some other way. And I think that would be a fitting introduction to our main speaker tonight, Lukas Kamienski. He's a writer. He's been researching the drug history or the use of intoxicants in warfare, and that's mainly what he's going to be talking about tonight. After Lucas's talk, there will be a brief interval, and after that we'll have a discussion on stage. The participants are Stuart Walton, who is also a writer. He was here yesterday, for those of you who missed him, talking about the cultural history of intoxicants and the attempts of society in modern ages to control the people's access to these substances that alter your consciousness. Bo Mæland, who is a professor and a vice rector, he has been working in the military for many years. He's written books on military ethics. And Brita Rangnes, who is a lecturer at the University of Stavanger, who will be talking about war in literature. So, welcome, Lukas Kamienski, please.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation and your kind introduction. Reports of Daesh fighters and terrorists and insurgents fueled by drugs on their murderous rampages have generated outrage. The vision of intoxicated jihadists adds an almost unthinkable level of fright, but perhaps it should not. There's nothing exceptional in Daesh fighters popping pills, for drugs and warfare has always gone hand in hand, from Homeric warriors to Wehrmacht troops, and more recently to American pilots during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Ukrainian combatants in the ongoing conflict with Russia. The use of intoxicants by non-Western irregulars is often portrayed as unique and shocking. But the fact is that Western soldiers have been fighting high on plenty of occasions for much of history. Well, for ISIS, the substance of choice is captagon, a powerful stimulant known as phentyline, which is metabolized in the body to form amphetamine. Invented in 1961, it has become a major recreational drug in the Middle East, but also a favored stimulant in the Syrian civil war. It makes for a good combat drug because it numbs fear, generates bravado, enhances strength, promotes alertness, alleviates pain, and probably also increases aggression when overdosed, which I guess often happens. Jihadists have been reported to consume it pervasively, while also taking powerful opioid painkillers, hashish, and probably cocaine and heroin too. Intoxicants transform them into ferocious, stimulated, and seemingly crazed fighters. Intoxication, although contrary to Islam, is not seen as immoral, but sacred. When fighters ingest drugs to meet religiously inspired goals, they are filled not only with courage, but also a sense of rightfulness. So in short, many jihadist fighters and terrorists are very often high on two powerful intoxicants, jihad and psychostimulants. Adversaries often compare intoxicated jihadists to zombies. In this way, they are made to seem inhumane, and an obvious mistake, but one that helps soldiers and witnesses to digest their incredible brutality. A Muslim Brotherhood militant in Syria recalls, and I quote, "Some people take so much, if you shot them, they won't drop." Fueled by captagon, jihadists continue fighting even when severely wounded, similar to the virulent, instinct-driven Walking Dead. This was precisely what the US Marines experienced in November 2004 in the Battle of Fallujah. The insurgents they were engaging with were so heavily doped up on amphetamine and cocaine that they continued fighting even when seriously injured. When the standard firing procedure to aim at the body failed, the Marines were ordered to refocus on headshots. Incidentally, this same tactic is suggested by Max Brooks in his famous zombie survival guide. But the experience of fighting with irregulars, with fierce, odd and pump up on drugs enemy is hardly new. When the British decided to subdue the Zulus in 1879, they did not expect to encounter the extremely determined resistance they did. The Zulu fought with fanaticism and fury, and they seemed immune to the enemy rifle fire. What made them truly fearless warriors was not only the traditional belligerence, but also Zulu pharmacopoeia. The warriors were provided by their shamans with various herbs to eat, drink, and inhale. These were, for example, intelezi, a traditional plant taken in purifying rites to boost morale, medicated beer, dager, the South African variety of cannabis, which has stimulating effect, but probably also toadstool, Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric that Stuart mentioned yesterday, as well as a potent painkiller and hallucinogen produced from the Bushman poison bulb. So had the British been familiar with the idea of zombie, they could probably have used it to describe the Zulus. But back to the present non-Western irregulars. Intoxicants seem to have become inherent to terrorism. Take two further examples. The Chechens, who in September 2004 seized the Russian school in Beslan, were heavy heroin and morphine addicts. During the 3-day siege, they ran out of supplies, and suffering from withdrawal symptoms turned extremely ruthless and massacred 200 children at the end. Separately, the Pakistani Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists who perpetrated a series of ferocious attacks in Mumbai in November 2008 enhanced their performance with steroids and cocaine, which enabled them to hold out against Indian special forces for nearly 60 hours. We know that Daesh has also drugged children, commonly with anti-anxiety medications to turn them into hardened fighters. Again, this is hardly new. Horrible as it may seem, the practice of drugging children to turn them into better combatants is a commonplace, an almost inherent feature in the child soldiering phenomenon. From Sierra Leone and Liberia to Iraq, from Somalia to Afghanistan, from East Timor to Mexico and Brazil, young fighters and drug cartel hit boys have been issued narcotics to facilitate recruitment and training, to improve morale and courage, to increase cruelty, as well as reward good performance. These are mostly cocaine and heroin, or they are mixed with bullet powder, which, by the way, allows for the consumption of greater amounts of cocaine and heroin at once. Other popular substances are marijuana, hashish, amphetamines, and psychotropic medications. But if junkie jihadists, juveniles included, are described as erratic, how then should we account for the behavior of Achilles, the archetypical Western hero? Homer portrays him as a frenzied warrior, experiencing extreme mood swings, losing control over his emotions, and wreaking astonishing slaughter. What would the neurochemical brain analysis tell us about this foundational Western hero? Well, Achilles certainly seems high most of the time. If I am allowed, I would speculate that he might have taken opium, which was well known and common in ancient Greece. It came from Egypt. And nearly certainly he drank wine heavily. After all, Victor Davis Hanson, a prominent scholar on the Greek way of warfare, tells us that it's almost certain that the Greek hoplite marched into battle drunk. Whatever the issue, Achilles was for sure high on hormones. Today, we could call him an adrenaline junkie. By any measure, Homeric heroes are few and far between. It is mere man that has to be roused to arms for a combatant to overcome survival instincts, cope with borderline stress and fears, and be ready for a sacrifice. He often needs extra motivation. Back to the 1980s, the prominent British military historian John Keegan, when answering the question of why soldiers fight, pointed to 3 factors: adjustment, coercion, and narcosis. Apart from a positive motivation, such as socialization to military life, primary group bonds, or a deeper sense of purpose, and a negative motivation, such as training, discipline, drill, obedience to authority, or punishment, soldiers frequently needed an additional chemical motivator. And this helps us understand why the use of drugs has been part of much of the history of war and violence. For imagine yourself as a soldier just about to go to battle. You may be a Russian infantryman in 1905 facing the Japanese. You may be Tommy, the proverbial British soldier in 1916 at the Western Front. You may be a Wehrmacht soldier far in the East in 1942. Or you may be American GI in the dense Vietnam jungle. You've been drugged by extreme fatigue for days now, with little sleep, small rations of food. You're cold, you're dirty. You've been sick a few times already. You no longer want to be where you are. You may feel how ridiculous it is to risk your life in a war that appears to have no sense to you. You feel hopeless. You want to escape from the brutish reality. But this is not an option. You have to face the enemy. You may well get shot and die. You may lose a limb. You've seen lots of killing and death, lots of maimed bodies. You may lose your best comrades. And how about your honor? You fear that you may not pass the test of battle and let your brothers in arms down. This is in fact what you may fear the most. In a word, you are an exhausted, stressed, and anxious man. And you are demanded to go over all these essentially human emotions. But how? A bit of chemical moderation might have a blessing effect. Call it a chemical courage or a liquid relief. Napoleon's famous dictum about armies marching on their stomachs needs to be developed further, for soldiers must also knock the butterflies from their stomachs. And it was early discovered that if men are expected to put a lot of tears, blood, and sweat, they need to be provided with some kind of chemical encouragement. The oldest and most popular was, of course, alcohol. And for centuries, governmental rations inspired Dutch courage, propelling troops into battle. Different nations had different drinks of choice. For the British, it was rum. For the Russians and Soviets, it was vodka. It was wine from the ancient Greeks, Romans, Chinese, and modern French. It was beer for the Germans. For the Americans, it was rum at first, and then after the Civil War, whiskey. So on and so forth. Well, until the end of the Second World War, wars were rarely fought sober. Moving to the First World War, we see cocaine brought to the front line. The drug was used, for example, by German and French pilots, Canadian infantrymen. The British Army used a medicine containing cocaine and an extract from kola nuts. The medicine was known as forced march or tabloid. it was successfully used during exhausting and long polar expeditions. So the military thought it might encourage fearlessness and offset combat fatigue, and in fact it did. Self-prescribed consumption was also widespread, as cocaine proved effective in the trenches. And many London pharmacies sold mail-ordered medical kits containing cocaine and heroin, advertising them as useful presents for friends at the front. So girls happily sent them to their boys, fiancés, and husbands in the trenches. What about the Second World War? Well, the stimulant of choice was amphetamines. The Nazi pioneered military doping as a wide-scale, systematic enterprise. The pill known as pervitin, which was an early version of crystal meth, was the drug of choice. It induced a strong feeling of confidence, hyperactivity, it boosted energy, decreased fatigue and appetite. In his book, Art of War, the ancient Chinese philosopher writes that speed is the essence of war, and this could not be more accurately remarked to describe the speedy war of Blitzkrieg, for which German forces were primed by chemical speed. Between April and December 1939, the Temmler-Werke company, the producer of pervitin, supplied the German military with 29 million pills. And many of them were used experimentally during the campaign against my country, Poland, in September 1939. As pervitin proved extremely useful, at the peak of Blitzkrieg, in the spring of 1940, troops were issued some 35 million pills. The Wehrmacht's amazing rapid advances appear less incredible given that in some units many soldiers took up to 4 3-milligram pervitin pills a day for weeks on end. Thus Blitzkrieg was significantly fueled by meth, which gave soldiers nearly superhuman ability. How could one otherwise explain tank units moving for 2 or 3 days non-stop? Or infantrymen making 1,600 kilometers a day? So German army on methamphetamine could fight longer with little rest. And this extensive use of drugs in the Third Reich, including Adolf Hitler, is the subject of Norman Ohler's fascinating book, Blitzed, Drugs in Nazi Germany, published last year in English, but now also available in the Norwegian translation as Hitler's Rus, published by Spartacus. Overall, it's estimated that between 1939 and 1945, German military consumed some 200 million methamphetamine pills. The German military was, of course, the first to introduce deliberate military doping, but soon Britain, the United States, and Japan followed, also administering amphetamines to their troops. It's estimated that British soldiers consumed some 72 million Benzedrine amphetamine pills. The drug was issued largely to pilots, but also to infantrymen. For example, on October 23rd, 1942, General Bernard Montgomery gave away some 100,000 Benzedrine pills to his 8th Army just before the Second Battle of El Alamein. So the British, high on speed, managed to win over the Germans high on meth. The role of uppers in the outcome of this battle remains, however, unknown. During the war, American soldiers used at least 250 million Benzedrine pills, popularly known among soldiers as bennies. Yet the total number might be as high as 500 million. This huge range in estimates results from the fact that we know the value of government contracts with SmithKline and French pharmaceutical company, but what we do not know is the exact price that the government procurement price for the drug, which was certainly much lower in the market price. Now, Japan. The Japanese emperor's army handed out tablets known as nekomoyo, or cat's eyes. Kamikaze, departing for their final missions, were not only given sake, the rice wine, but also tokuyo, that is methamphetamine mixed with powdered green tea. Remember, generally, kamikaze were not volunteers. So imagine yourself torn with doubts and fears, departing for a one-way mission. Wouldn't you rather go a bit pill-popped? I definitely would. In short, World War II was, to a great extent, fought on speed. The Americans continued to boost their troops with amphetamines after the Second World War. So when we moved to the Korean conflict, the administration of dextroamphetamine became commonplace. And the war also saw American servicemen stationed in Korea and Japan concocting the speedball, the injectable mixture of amphetamine and heroin. The soldiers discovered how to increase the effect of self-prescribed speed. But it was Vietnam War that saw the immense consumption of psychoactive substances, both prescribed and self-prescribed. In a word, authorized speed popping was rampant. In 1971, a congressional report revealed that between 1966 and 1969, armed forces used 225 dextroamphetamine pills. According to the Pentagon, in 1968, some 50% of American soldiers were taking drugs. In 1973, in the year of US withdrawal, this figure jumped to 70%. Half of soldiers doing drugs smoked marijuana, some 30% smoked or took heroin and opium. And more to recent times, during the Gulf War, 1990-1991, it's estimated that some 58% of American pilots participating in Operation Desert Storm enjoyed dextroamphetamine support, and 17% flight regularly on go pills, as legal uppers are referred to in the US military, go pills. As for the present day, the US Air Force jet and bomber plane pilots embarking on missions longer than 8 hours in the case of one-manned flights, or exceeding 12 hours for two-person crews, can each time, if all requirements are met, obtain 10 milligram dextroamphetamine pills. They keep them in their cockpits, and it's up to them whether they take it or not. It's up to them when they take it. But once they take it, they should keep taking until landing. Beginning in 2003, amphetamine go pills have been slowly replaced by a new generation of psychostimulant, an algoric that I referred to yesterday, modafinil, and apparently modafinil is colloquially known as zombie pill. But what I want to make clear is that these go pills are not abused. They are consumed under strict control procedures. They are basically safe, and they are used as a fatigue management tool. Today, officially, the US military is the only armed force that allows for controlled pharmacologically assisted combat, and it's limited only to pilots. However, the Chinese army is reported to introduce its own smart drug, and it's known in the West as Night Eagle. And you may wonder, how about the Russians? Well, who knows? At any Russian pharmacy, there are plenty of what Americans call nootropics or smart drugs. You might be surprised, but these are actually performance enhancers, easily available. And they were initially developed for cosmonauts and soldiers in Afghanistan in the 1980s. They work slightly like modafinil. Phenotropil, phenobut, metraprot, or wildonium, and several of these drugs were, as I said, used in Afghanistan in the 1980s to achieve the same effects as dextroamphetamine and methamphetamine. And metatrope is still given to special forces, Spetsnaz, or rapid response teams in times of crisis. And it's very interesting that most of these drugs are unheard of in the West. So I hope that just these few random examples show you that intoxicants have been an important part of war, experience. And if I may, I would like to sum up. Throughout history, drugs have been used in the battlefield for 5 basic purposes. First, stimulants were effective in keeping soldiers alert and awake, and hence alive. They combated fatigue and allowed men to go on with little sleep, little rest. Uppers, in a word, helped to enhance combat performance. Second, drugs inspired courage and provided relief from the stress of battle. In other words, intoxicant helped transform men into warrior. In his famous book, The Anatomy of Courage, Lord Moran, Winston Churchill's physician, argues that every soldier has a certain unique supply of courage. A man's courage is his capital and he's always spending, writes Moran. So no man has an unlimited stock of courage, but it's possible for soldiers to replenish it. And applying Moran's metaphor, drugs can be read as a means of feeding individual accounts of courage with special supplies, with extra supplies. Yet the problem with chemical courage is that the asset cannot be saved for later use. So it's but for short-term spending. Recharging has to be repeated, which can and often was habit-forming. Third, drinking and drugging rituals helped soldiers to bond and created trust, primary good relations. The Shakespearean bond of brothers, if you like. And this was crucial for group cohesion, for morale, for motivation, for good performance. Fourth, intoxicants helped warriors to cope with the traumas of war. Drug use was simply a response to the hardships of battle, to horrors of battle, and when combat ended, mind-altering substances, basically downers, provided a healing benefit. Remember, preventing or delaying mental breakdown has always been high on the priority list of the commanders. And finally, drugs were often taken to kill boredom and monotony. Soldiers reached for intoxicants because they simply had not much else to do. Boredom, in fact, became one of the characteristics of modern war, which was particularly vivid in Vietnam. In his outstanding war memoir, Rumor of War, Philip Caputo confirms that 9/10 of war is waiting around for the remaining 1/10 to happen. And as a rejoinder to Stuart's yesterday great talk, let me quote this great passage from Friedrich Nietzsche again. When he wrote that who will ever relate the whole history of narcotica, it's almost the history of culture, the so-called higher culture. He could have also had military culture in mind. although largely neglected by military history scholarship, intoxicants and various practices of intoxication have been nearly an integral part of war culture. War might be, as the great Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz, be an extension of politics, but it's also an extension of culture, as famously claimed by John Keegan, Clausewitz's prominent critique. Yet often, it's also an extension of pharmacology. In the 21st century, am I out of time? Okay. In the 21st century, I would argue it may also be an extension of biotechnology. Let me mention just some areas of the ongoing military research and development that may contribute to the rise of brave new soldiers of the future American military. The Pentagon is searching for yet another generation of smart drugs. And one of the research is on ampakins, the compound that affects glutamatergic AMPA receptor in the brain, which selectively blinds those receptors. And some research proves very, very promising as performance enhancer, alertness promoter. Research is also underway on new generation of sleeping pill, aiming at reprogramming the architecture of sleep, making it more regenerative. The idea is to have sleeping pills with an alarm clock, so they induce a good quality of sleep for 3, 4, or 6 hours, and then you wake up regenerated. Another area of research is for drugs that could prevent PTSD, war trauma. We know that blocking beta-adrenergic receptors in the brain can suppress the creation of emotional memories, strong emotional memories, and subsequently prevent anxiety disorders. One of the compounds intensively researched for over a decade now is propranolol, in use since 1964 for high blood pressure and arrhythmia, very common, but scientists found it has another side effects. And finally, pharmacogenetics slowly opens the door to individuals' pharmacology. So the future military may well be designing drugs tailored to individual soldiers, bespoke for their genetic profiles. And I hope we can discuss the rise of biotechnology, also cyber technologies, probably later in the evening. Because I believe that true Blade Runners, Terminators, and Iron Mans are no longer science fiction. This is happening. This is happening in the United States. Science fiction turns science reality. Especially when it comes to brain stimulation, brain-to-computer interfaces, brain-to-brain interfaces, and so on and so forth, implantable RFID chips, bionic exoskeletons. But all these new biotech projects and developments are, I would argue, not the same as the traditional use of drugs in combat. Why not? Well, biotechnology applied to the military may threaten to take away human agency for good. It may take human agency out of the equation of war. It's a dystopian vision of scientific way of warfare, purely scientific way of warfare. And this might be, I'm afraid, extremely risky. For us, Thucydides reminds us the essence of war is that it's a human thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an extremely interesting introduction to a very complicated and far-reaching subject. When you were talking about this theory of individual soldiers having a limited supply of courage, I was reminded of a book by an author called Evan Wright, who wrote about, it's called Generation Kill, and it's about the second Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. And he said that many of the soldiers that he accompanied, they were Marines, and they were among the first to cross the border between Kuwait and Iraq when they were attacked, had no actual combat experience from before. So, and they had learned a lot about combat by playing video games. And one of the soldiers remarked to him that one of the most frustrating things about actual warfare was that you could not pick up additional life and health and weaponry on your way, as you do in the games. So he was sort of, frustrated by the lack of, stimulants and courage that you could pick up while you were playing. But I would very much like to come back to this when we discuss later, and especially Professor Mæland. But in your research, have you found that the extensive use of drugs in warfare has been discussed in terms of ethics when it comes to the rules of engagement? And I'm thinking, if you are so out of it on drugs that you're no longer able to make good moral choices, is this in itself a breach of the rules of war?
My impression is that the popular view that soldiers, when self-medicating, are, completely getting addicted or high and lose touch with reality is exaggerated, because remember, soldiers are not full men. They know the risk. So usually when they take drugs, they do it after the combat, or they do it in barracks, in safe environment. So, when it comes, for example, to the US soldiers in Iraq or Afghanistan, you may find some examples of units taking pervasively opioid painkillers, drinking heavily, etc., etc. But we cannot generalize that it's the whole picture of the, say, US military, because the most popular intoxicant when it came, well, not intoxicant, but kind of stimulant, were energizing drinks and liquid nicotine. So, I would say that the question is relevant and crucial, but officially, self-medication was not that much allowed, and is not allowed, is forbidden. So,
yeah.
There is this linkage and close association between legal norms and ethical concerns, although they sometimes overlap. For example, during the Second World War, drunkenness was a heavy problem in Wehrmacht, to such an extent that Hitler issued a ban and threatened death punishment. But the commanders couldn't follow the order, because they simply couldn't forbid their men to not
be
drink,
a riot or a mutiny or something.
it was one of the only possible relief after the heavy combat.
Of course, and also it's before we end, it's sort of interesting to think about what's the worst. Is it the things that are being done by people who are high, or is it the things that are being done by people who are sober? I'm not sure about the answer, but we'll take a short break so you can go to the toilet or go to the bar, whatever, and we'll be back in, say, 5 minutes.
Hallo, hallo. Hei. Jeg håper de fleste har fått forfrisket seg og vært i der de måtte være. Så må jeg huske å snakke engelsk. Ja. Okay, welcome back to the second part of this discussion. I thought I would like to start off with Stuart Walton, who was here yesterday. He has been researching and writing about the cultural use of stimulants and drugs. And Stuart, what is your reaction to what Lukáš has now told us?
Well, the thing I was initially most interested in the final part of Lukáš's great talk, was the idea that the military might be able to tailor individual intoxicant substances to the individual fighting man or woman. I also strongly suggest that civil authorities target individual drugs to the individual writer as well, and in which case my job would be made altogether more pleasant and easier. I read and reviewed Lukáš's book last year. It's an extremely fine and well-researched and deeply fascinating piece of work that I learned an awful lot from. The question I'd like to put initially, I think, to Lukáš, which it seems the most obvious question, is since drugs of one sort or another have been present in virtually all conflict, is it actually possible that conflict might be unthinkable without them? Is it? I mean, this is a very fundamental question, but if drugs are being specifically issued by military authorities in order to continue with the prosecution of war, especially when we know that you can't possibly begin to predict the individual effects that they're going to have, other than you hope that you'll produce endurance and alertness and a combative spirit. Is it possible to imagine the prosecution of a long international war without substances?
Honestly speaking, I can't imagine. I mean, since the end of the Second World War, you see this policy of moving away from governmental rations of alcohol and issuing, for instance, uppers. But as I tried to show you, it was not the case with the US. It's not probably the case with the Russians. It's not the case with irregulars. So you may imagine Western regular armies limiting the use of intoxicants, especially uppers. But on the other hand, you've got the non-Western enemies who is doing completely the reverse. And now you face the irregular, highly intoxicated and less predictable enemy. And the question is, well, is it fair, or is this policy of banning or prohibiting use of intoxicants, especially uppers, not our weakness? I mean, this raises obviously huge ethical question because it's contrary to the Western politics of prohibition, etc., etc. But I would say if we look at the military use of uppers purely in instrumental terms as a tool that can bring tactical advantage, tactical edge, meaning possibly enabling victory, reducing the cases of our casualties, is it ethically okay to not go for it? But indirectly answering your question, I'm guessing that what intoxicants will be replaced in 10 or 20 years will be cyborg technologies. So you can achieve almost the same effects by stimulating special areas of your brain. So you can actually have the same effect as after taking amphetamine, but longer lasting, 3-4 months, zero side effects, or almost zero as far as we are now concerned, and almost non-ethical questions that surround drug taking. I mean, you're taking nothing. Something is just put on the surface of your brain, and you're charged.
So the goal would be a drug which promoted and intensified combat effectiveness, but without also having recreational potential.
Yes.
A boring drug.
Yes. Don't want that.
Bo Mæland, you have been looking at military ethics for a long time, and my perception and my own experiences from the Norwegian Armed Forces is that it's drug-free, or it pertains to be. And to my knowledge, the only Norwegian personnel who have been involved in actual combat since the end of World War are special forces who have been in operations abroad. Do you know if they are drug-free?
Well, there's some sound here. Yeah. In fact, I just called my best friend, who is also has been a chaplain to the special forces for a long time, right before I came here tonight, just to ask him about that. And he has served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And he seemed to confirm that yes, they're drug-free. What he told me is that he has been astonished how some U.S. troops have been heavily drugged by antidepressants at the military hospitals in order to get them back to the field, in order to send them back to the United States, like in a military hospital in Germany. So they are kind of revitalized in order to go another mile, as it were. But I tend to think that our soldiers are drug-free, and we've seen also, well, the last 20 years, a shift from, let's say, UN peacekeeping operation, where there's socializing element of drinking alcohol, having a brandy or a glass of beer and a cigar in the night, just to relieve and kind of talk together and enjoy the comradeship and talking about what's home and so on, moving into and there will be occasionally like people drinking too much in like platoon headquarters, privates here and there, and it was kind of knocked down and behave, but they were not sent home. I mean, in individual cases where people regularly drunk in their room or so on, they would be repatriated, but not with this kind of outburst kind of occasionally.
You have to vent somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was interpreted somehow like that. Yes. But later in the peace enforcement operation, like K4, I4, S4, and also in Iraq, Afghanistan, it was a much stricter line, either a zero policy or a 1 can beer a day policy.
And so that's what also because you are, when you are deployed, you are, in principle, you are on duty all the time.
Yeah, sure. So it's really dangerous. So today I still doubt that this is a big thing with the Norwegian forces. And of course, that would be my question to you, Lukas. The relation between the short-term pros versus the long-term consequences of using drugs, because it may have an immediate effect on the instrumentality, as it were, of the armed forces in those operations, but on the long term, saying weeks or months, would they eventually deteriorate somehow, the units?
For sure, it depends on the substance we're talking about. The historical example, a good example is Wehrmacht and Second World War. So initially, the meth was silver bullet drug. But quite soon the commanders discovered side effects, also disobedience, and the most important side effect being amphetamine hangover, which made soldiers disabled for combat 1 or 2 days later. If you overdose with dextroamphetamine, you've got the same side effect. That's why it's crucially important to have this strict control policy, and when it comes to drugs prescribed by the military, we see over time this growing awareness of side effects, and it's being like corrected, if you like. However, I think you touched an important thing talking about antidepressants, because it's the military itself, it's the government itself, when it comes to the United States at least, that is drugging or turning soldiers into addicts somehow. Antidepressants is one thing. The whole story began in Vietnam. That's why they got such a low PTSD rate, like 1% in theater. But when the soldiers get back, it was an epidemic. But the same was the case in Iraq and Afghanistan with opioid painkillers. I mean, the medics and paramedics prescribed them like crazy. So between 2001, 2009, they issued almost 4 million prescriptions for very, very heavy opioid painkillers. And back to the US, you've got now the epidemic of opioid painkillers prescription. 260 million prescriptions a year, 38,000 death cases from overdosing. So, you cannot analyze the military out of the social context. It goes hand in hand somehow, although the military should be more strict. But in this case, what is very important is the short-term policy. The idea is to recycle the soldier, either physically or mentally sick, and send him as quickly as possible back to the front, because it's a precious resource.
I just wanted to keep with the Norwegian forces for a little while, being in Norway and everything, because what my understanding is that the Norwegian special forces are in very high regard internationally. They are regarded as very professional, very efficient soldiers, and that sort of seems to contravene the thesis that warfare is not possible without stimulants of some kind. And I'm wondering, is it possible to switch or to have some kind of another stimulant, for instance, motivation, the king and country thing, what they call it, the warrior culture that you have in certain units. Is that a substitute for that, do you think?
Well, I think that's a very interesting perspective, and also related to what you ended up with a human agency perspective. How can we secure that war still is conducted in a humane way or by humans? And I think, well, relating to my book, just to make some marketing, not on military ethics, but on military boredom, but I've also done some studies on military ethics. And this is where I kind of come across some of these narcotics episodes, especially in the Vietnam War, so that kind of resonates very well with yours very robust studies, I must say. But my take is that not the too much things like the anxiety or the stress and all that, but also the inner stressors from the kind of low scale, like boredom, monotony, nothing happens, waiting, to less meaning, and so on. They are also a kind of enemy that you have to fight and combat, and you also have to find alleviation against such stressors. And one of our findings in this book is that the role of friendship was very, very strong. So where people could talk, meet, and be together, the strength of bonding. You talked about using drugs and alcohol for bonding and socializing, but also bonding itself may be a stimulus to counter those kind of negative downwards forces. So yes, I think motivation, like with the irregular soldiers of the Islamist extremists, how religion or the sacred or the jihad can be that kind of motivation. Of course, when added or combined with narcotics, that is a splendid cocktail. But even alone, that might be a very strong force to do what you're asked to do. But I think yes, and that would be my kind of moral stance also, that we have to find those humane ways of countering the need for narcotics to do what you have to do in order to combat your enemy.
Before we go on to the side of literature, so that you won't think that I'm ignoring you, Britta, Stuart, yesterday in your very interesting lecture, you spoke for a society where the access to drugs is not limited as it is today, because you say first the war on drugs has failed utterly and completely worldwide, and also maybe because there is a moral issue with denying people access to an altered state of mind on a more philosophical level also. But in such a society where drugs are more available and legally available, wouldn't that also mean that drugs would be present in modern day warfare to a greater extent? And what kind of dilemmas does that pose?
Yes, I mean, it definitely would. And the interesting thing about Lukasz's analysis of this is that there are two levels of drug use by combatants. One is the purely recreational, the way that soldiers take drugs in their downtime in order to get over what they've just done or what they have to do next, the boredom that Bort mentioned. And so that, in a sense, is an extension of civil society, that soldiers kind of reminding themselves of what their lives were like back home. But the really interesting question about this is exactly what the intention is of deliberate prescription of intoxicants to fighting forces while they're in the field is about. And it seems to me there's a sort of, it becomes very hazy, that you begin by saying, yes, this is about making, allowing you to go for 3 days without sleeping and producing the right level of aggression and engagement. But after that has gone away, or when that starts becoming less easy to control, at what level does it start becoming, well, this is just a way of subverting your normal level of consciousness, so that in this unbelievable quagmire that you're now sunk up to the eyeballs in, that any state that you go into that's not your normal state is better than I don't know, but there seems something very unpredictable about this. We talked a little bit last night about the CIA experimenting with LSD.
Still, there is this problem of imitation. Like once soldiers are given prescribed drugs and they feel they work, probably they may do more, overcome, limitations. And then they feel they are not given enough. They try to find out subsidize themselves. And it was the case in the Second World War, Korean War, and Vietnam War. So once they were not given enough methamphetamine or amphetamine, they were trying to get more by themselves from home or from the black market. And this is this line that is very, very thin between prescription and controlled use and addiction. So, that's why you might claim sometimes that the government is the dealer and is making soldiers addicted. And let's be honest, what matters is combat and combat effectiveness, the effects in the field. And what doesn't that much matter is what happens afterwards with the veteran. Well, it changed recently, especially after the Vietnam, but it still is not that much priority. So this is the problem of imitation somehow. Once you see that what you are given is useful, either for being invigorated or calmed down, you try to follow the same path.
You could argue, I guess, that in times of war, the individual soldier is just a tool to bring the weapon to the enemy. So, and that kind of trumps all other moral obligations you might have. Your obligation is to win.
True. But you don't follow every single order.
Of course you don't.
And it's called moral agency. So, you know, it's up to you whether you finally decide to fulfill orders. You have to decide if they are legal and morally justified or not. I mean, if you're ordered to kill civilians, you don't follow it.
There are many examples of people following that order. But I wanted to move a little bit towards the field of literature, and just saying that until your book came out and a couple of other quite recent books, I was personally not aware of the extent of the industrialization of drug use during all these conflicts. And I'm curious as to why that might be. Has this been sort of a secret? Why hasn't this been discussed in literature, in you know, both facts and fiction literature earlier? And Britta, why, when you're thinking about war and literature, what comes to mind for you?
I think that a lot of things come to mind, and of course the problem with that question is that there is very little that you can exclude in terms of literature, because so much of our literature is generated in or relates to war.
War or love?
War and love, and then the ocean, of course. But I think that there are, and I must say that I think you're right in terms of the link between war, drugs, and fiction is perhaps not something that has been extensively researched. But at the same time, if we think about the relationship between war and at least Western literature and most literature, if you, for instance, go back to the Iliad, like you've been quoting as well, you find this concept of not being high in war, but being high on war, as you talked about, where you see Achilles, you said he might be on drugs, he's definitely high on adrenaline, you said. And it's very interesting if you look at the very opening of the Iliad. It says, the very first thing it does, it invokes the muse, as the epic poem does. But it says, "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses." But it invokes that rage, which is, of course, the driving force of what he's doing. And it becomes, even though, as you said, he is high on adrenaline, and we can discuss whether his actions are deplorable or not. But at the same time, there is that ideal of warfare that we can find for a very long time, and you talk about the Shakespearean band of brothers, for instance, which of course is very much there in terms of a bond between soldiers, but there is also, we have to remember that that band of brothers isn't just between the soldiers, it is also between the writer and his audience, the actors and the audience. So it's the general public as well who are part of this. If we think of, for instance, the opening of Henry V, where he's trying to create, it's like he's trying to get the audience on board, saying, imagine now the fields of Agincourt, imagine that heroic battle, we're all in this together, and so on. So this is a time when you have the audience on board, in a sense, in this war, where you're high on war, everyone is agreeing. And then, of course, when you start getting into, let's say, post-American Civil War, at least post-World War I, you see a very strong shift in the general audience, because all of a sudden, it's much more difficult to have the readers, the general audience, as complicit in this act of war, because perhaps now stories of war become more testimony than anything else. And they become stories about the atrocities of war rather than the heroics of war. And then, of course, all of a sudden, things become much more complicated. And that's what literature does. It complicates things, right? So when I listen to you talking about, well, the greater good, the shorter cons for the greater pros, and it becomes very clinical. And it becomes very, you talk about sort of warfare on a very on a state level or a very, very governmental level. But if you look at some of the stories, and can I just give an example of one story here?
You may.
It's a wonderful writer, and if you haven't read it, she's called Chimamanda Adichie. She's a Nigerian writer, and she published 10 years ago, she published a glorious book that's called Half of the Yellow Sun, that is set in Nigeria at the time of the Biafran War. And one of the main characters, or one of the characters whose story we hear in this novel, is called Ugwu, and he comes into a very educated household. He's illiterate, and he's being brought up, and he is then recruited or is forced into the Biafran War as a soldier. And the reader is extremely sympathetic towards Ugwu. And then, at one point, well into the novel, Ugwu he's high on homemade gin and on wee-wee, Nigerian marijuana. And then he is forced into participating in a gang rape, sort of a military action, which then, of course, is something completely different for the person being subject to that. Then it becomes very difficult to talk about a greater good. It becomes very difficult to talk about this kind of, this on an abstract level. And I think that might be what literature helps us do, is it takes it away from that abstraction of warfare and reminds us that it isn't all about cyber technology, or it's about managing, it's about the government prescribing, but it's also about individuals and people being subject to what's going on.
I was thinking about something similar, which is really a question to all of you. If you think that the less morally justified the conflict is, the more use you have for drugs in the conflict. That there's sort of an opposite between, you know, if you're talking about acts of valor and you're defending home and country and your wife there at home, little children, you know, you don't need that. But if you're engaged in some conflict you can barely understand in a faraway country, and you're possibly one of the bad guys, even, who knows, drugs become much more attractive to you in a way. I don't know.
Well, I guess Lucas can answer that, but before, I think it's a very crucial question, because I think we have seen some of this on the Norwegian scene lately, how we don't view the conflicts we send soldiers to as existential but voluntary. They are an instrument for the state, and the soldiers also feel that they don't have 100% support from home. And in the Vietnam War, the people really turned their back to the soldiers. There were no one really to receive them when they went home. And in our book, we talk about public boredom. People just, they're ignorant, and they don't feel anything about those soldiers. And we've seen it in the Norwegian debate about the lack of moral justification, or the presumption of a lack of morality for sending soldiers out. I think what compensates that lack is not necessarily drugs, but it can be, and you might tell something about that, but the professionalism and the bond of the unit, how they fight or they work, their soldiers, for their military ethos and professionalism. That is very, very strong.
Lucas?
Well, many things. I'd like to refer to your comment, which is crucial, I would say. When we look to the roots, to the Greeks, we see the origins of drama. And it had nothing to do with literature. It had all to do with war. Because
something to do with literature.
Just the Iliad and
just a little bit. plays were written by former generals like Sophocles, for example. Sophocles, for example, to welcome homecoming soldiers and to show that the society welcomes them, to say that the society thanks what they did, and to send a clear message that what you did, even all these atrocities, were ethically acceptable because you did it for a purpose. And I think this group and social ritual, you can call it a group catharsis, was crucial for adjusting homecoming soldiers to the society. And one of the crucial arguments of people who are trying to find the ways of dealing with PTSD today is that it's too much medicalized, you know, as you said, too clinical. While PTSD is as old as war. I mean, war trauma gets back to the ancient times. It's a very natural and human thing to feel bad about what you did and what you experienced. But this social adaptation through culture, so to speak, play or drama, was essential. And what we lack today is this kind of group welcoming. And you picked up this subject of general rejection of soldiers coming back. And it's not only about professionalization, not only about Vietnam, but also, you know, for example, U.S. Marines coming back from Iraq and being called, you know, baby killers because CNN showed it. So it's a big problem, big thing, really. And but there is some hope. There was a great project founded by DoD, apparently, and it was called Theater of War. There was a group of actors reading fragments from Ajax and Philoctetes, I guess, to the audience of former military active soldiers and their families. And the reaction was that actually what Ajax experienced was exactly what they experienced. And you know, they are very happy that they are not crazy, they are not abnormal. It's normal, it's human. So this was this, and I think it's still going. They're showing this theater of war in military bases over the US. Very successful project, and so to speak, getting back to the real origins. But I think much more should be done in this direction of storytelling, not, you know, giving drugs. Literature is not only the reflection on war, on horrors or individual experience, but it's also a medium that helps to integrate society with soldiers, veterans with soldiers. And I would see this role as one of the quite important throughout the ages. Also, with creating the image of the hero, the image of, you know, honorable service, honorable warrior, etc., etc.
Lucas, I'm also curious to know what you think about, you know, the lack of, you know, research on this before recently. And I was thinking if the Germans kept taking speed after they came home after the war, that might explain why they were able to rebuild the country so fast, but that's another thing. But why has this been underplayed in a way?
I have a few ideas about it. The first explanation would be that all the substances we are talking today and calling them drugs were not drugs. I mean, they were in common use. Like, you know, you could take cocaine.
Medicine. It was medicine.
It was either medical heroin or medical cocaine or just amphetamine, which was available without prescription in the US until 1951, and in case of benzedrine inhaler for nasal ingestions until 1965 without prescription. So, you know, in all this stuff like opiates, morphine, and heroin, they were not regarded as drugs, as prohibited, illicit substances. They were maybe not in a common use, but in a sense, because they were parts of medicines, they were in normal use. Yeah. That's why using them by the military didn't generate any, outrage or surprise. The second thing would be that once you get a silver bullet, like for example with methamphetamine and Nazi Germany, you don't talk about it overtly because you may lose the tactical edge. And this is what exactly happened when the British found strange pills with Luftwaffe pilots shot down over Britain. They started searching what was exactly this pill, and they discovered it's methamphetamine. And then it started, their own research with amphetamine on board, and this is how they introduced. So the Germans lost the secret. And the third thing, I would say, the third reason is because most historians, including military historians, still regard it as a background issue. It's like an anecdote, which doesn't have anything with the big picture, like, the battle, the numbers, the figures, the weapons, the diplomacy. More sensationalist than actually hard data. And this is what sometimes also comes up with some of the reviews of my book or Norman Orwell's book. Like, these are just useful details, but nothing more. And that's it. And my assumption is maybe because we don't know whether drug taking had any effect on, final outcome of a battle or a campaign, but at least we shouldn't neglect it. I mean, it gives a better background picture for the whole military history, I guess.
Yeah, of course. Also, we have a mic for the audience, so if you have any questions, please just raise a hand or communicate to me. And you can always, of course, you can ask the, in Norwegian, and I will translate for you if you need. So please, raise a hand. Anyone? Not even Mr. Nesvold? Yeah. Yes, we have a question in the back.
Hello. I was thinking about something we were talking about yesterday, and I was thinking about if we can follow it up. It was about empathy and drugs. I think it was last year we saw the news that paracetamol reduced compassion in people. And yesterday we talked about modafinil as a drug that could reduce compassion in soldiers. Do you guys see a market for this, or as a potential, I don't know, empathy and compassion reducing thing in conflicts, until perhaps conflicts will be done with algorithms, I guess, in the end, or up till this point? I don't know.
Well, the only thing that comes to my mind is that there are instances where you are, I mean, one thing is flying as a pilot like thousands of feet above the terrain, but as an infantry soldier, you will sometimes come very close to a site where you have to decide whether or not to do something. And how you interpret and understand what you see at that very scene will determine the outcome of your action. So in certain given situations, seeing certain kinds of people, empathy certainly would play into that total picture and judgment you're about to do. So just as a very principled and theoretical answer.
Yeah, I don't know if I dare to say this, but I saw this TV series with my son. He's 21, and he introduced me to this program called Black Mirror. It's I don't know if you know it. And it was this episode. I've only seen one episode, and it was about war.
Man Against Fire.
And it was this soldier that was programmed to see his enemies like monsters, and we also saw them like monsters. And I thought, aha! When you talked about this instrumental drugs, it was like, I thought, well, this is science fiction, but it's like there is this kind of terrifying scenario when it comes to what can come in the future to kind of yeah, that these soldiers, well, what you also talked about, that you have no empathy because these enemies are monsters. And of course it was kind of very, for me it was very, I felt so, because we were also manipulated as watchers to this series, because we also saw them as monsters, these, and I thought it was really, it was like a science fiction, but it's perhaps something that can happen, not only by taking drugs, but that you're really programmed with a little chip or something. I don't know, but it was like very scary, and I think perhaps it can become reality.
If I understand you correctly, this is something that it's imminent. It will happen any day.
I'm not talking about the near future, but it's already somewhere. I mean, if you join together different projects, different ideas, different possibilities, it's becoming really scary. And I find this episode you're talking about, Man Against Fire, extremely inspiring, because it shows almost a perfect instrument of achieving all military desired goals. So you've got the humanization of the enemy, which is killing. This is, by the way, what basic military training is also about. Like, to kill without reflection in terms of not having remorse or, grief. It's about being free of horrors and trauma, because this interface erases bad memories. No smell, nothing, so you don't have, you remember, but you feel nothing about it. And this is, by the way, what the new paradigm of PTSD prevention aims to do. It's about designing drug which wouldn't erase your brain, but which wouldn't allow your brain to memorize in an emotional way. And by the way, propranolol that I mentioned seems to be highly promising, but there are some controversies about it. So if you administer the drug for 2 weeks after the traumatic event, you may achieve a wonderful effect of no PTSD. So you remember bad event, but you don't feel anything about it. And finally, there is this amazing idea which, well, is in the title, because the title of the episode comes from the famous study of the US soldiers from the Second World War by Marshall, Man Against Fire. Obviously, his controversial idea is and thesis that soldiers were not willing to kill, so they were not effective enough. And it also gets back to the Civil War, when there were many rifles loaded, discovered from the battlefield, especially from the after the Battle of Gettysburg. And the question is, well, it's impossible that they didn't manage to fire before they were killed. They just simply didn't want to fire, or they fired wanting to miss. And then you've got this psychological and social engineering approach, which is nicely called killology. That is to say, how to make soldiers more willing to kill other human beings. And I believe this science fiction episode well captures all these dilemmas and also technological cyborg possibilities. Obviously, the way it's shown is fiction, but if you merge interface, chips, and pharmacology, you may get something which is close.
You said something about this dream that was very kind of, you can sleep for 4 hours and you have very recreational, and that was also part of the episode about this kind of everybody.
It's
all the soldiers
yes.
dreamt the same dream.
Yes, indeed, they were rewarded with nice erotic dreams for good performance, for good kills, which reminds me US GIs in Vietnam that were rewarded for good kills with 2 or 3 extra cans of beer and extra time to drink up this beer. But you had to prove it. I mean, you had to prove that you killed somebody.
I think we have another question down there.
Just a follow-up question on that. If we assume that in the very close future that we can tailor-make the drug to the individual soldier, and they will not smell or they will not feel, I'm very curious to know how this will be portrayed in the literature in the future, Britta. How will we have kind of, who will be the war hero in 10 or 20 years' time? Do you think this will come out, or?
I have no idea. That's the short question. But I do think that one thing that literature does, as I said, is it tells the stories of actual human beings. And not just literature, but culture. And if we go back to what you were talking about, the monsters, I mean, we always have, we have this concept of the monster in not just in warfare, but in culture, right? And we see how our concepts of monsters, for instance, evolve in culture. So the vampire of 2010 was very different from the vampire of 1880, right? So it evolves. And when you, for instance, talk about the zombie, we know that now, I mean, the zombie used to be this category that could be killed without, I mean, I'm talking culturally now, right? On television, for instance, the zombie could represent everything that just could be extinguished, and that you could kill without repercussions or without feeling bad for it, because all it was an enemy. It was someone out to get you. It had no soul, it was pure body, and it was out to kill you. So it could be very safely killed. And now, of course, as we start to become aware of the fact that monsters are always something other, they always represent something in our culture. Now we are starting to humanize zombies more and more as well as a culture. And I think that it is very difficult to envision that literature is going to go along with a concept of dehumanizing anyone. I think the opposite is going to happen always, because that is, I mean, these perspectives are, I'm not trying to say that this isn't making me, as I said, I just want to go home and sleep for a decade. But I think that one of the things that literature, that art does, is it speaks up. And it tells us that you're about to dehumanize something that cannot be dehumanized. And then, of course, it's up to us whether or not we listen. But I have a very hard time thinking that art is going to be different in that respect. It's going to deal with something else, because we have no idea what it needs to deal with in 10 years. But it's still going to deal with inhumanity and dehumanization. But how, I don't know.
We have time for one more brief question, and then we have to start thinking about wrapping it up. We're closing to 2 hours now. So please.
First, I want to thank you for a very stimulating evening. I think I learned a lot, and it's really something that we have to think about. And one of the things I really liked was when you're saying that there is a very thin line between recreational use of drugs during war and addiction. And maybe it's in wartime that these thin lines are really becoming thin. And then I wanted to introduce what we have already talked about Bruce Alexander, who is famous for his rat park experiments that are not that very important. The important thing is some of his concepts. And he says that addiction evolves when two criteria is there. The first is that you're engaged in something overwhelmingly. And in wartime, you're really overwhelmingly involved in something, both in the war itself, but then, of course, also in the taking of drugs in many cases, or in becoming very involved with your comrades. And then he says the second criteria is that you become dislocated from all other kinds of relations, both to activities and people and everything. And then I think that is something what is very frightening about also the Norwegian soldiers. They are not relocated. They are dislocated from the society that they are sent out from, and they are not relocated. So what happened then? Well, they are on a strict policy when it comes to not taking drugs, not drinking during combat or when in the field, but they are not secure from drinking and other kinds of problems as soon as they experience their no relocation experience coming home. And that's when the really big problems arise for most of them. It was the same thing for the Vietnam veterans and everyone.
Thank you. I think that question is works very well as something that you can reflect on in your closing remarks. So just quickly, we can start with you, Stuart, and then go that way.
I just want to refer to briefly to a theory which is very tantalizing, which is that the Christmas, the fraternization between British and German troops that took place on the Western Front at the Christmas of 1914, and which led to forces on both sides saying that under no circumstances was this ever to happen again. They played football famously and shared their rations and so on. The theory was that the reason it happened is because they were all on ecstasy, which had been invented in Germany 2 years before the start of the war, which is an idea, of course, straight out of La La Land, but is so beautiful that it ought to be true.
Brita?
I agree. No, I'm not. I don't think I'm the best equipped to talk about how we relocate anyone in that sense. But I do think that it is really crucial, as you were talking about as well, that we do have a discourse and that we have a community that deals with this, and that we deal with the bad, yes, but that doesn't mean that we also that criticizing something means dislocating ourselves as a society from it and from people involved in it, because I think we need to make that distinction.
Thank you for your question or comment. I'm not sure I have an answer, but I have at least two perspectives. And one is, of course, what we hear about US veterans committing suicide, like 22 persons a day. Norwegian soldiers at the time being, not talking about Lebanon in 1978 and things following after that, but from current operations or near current operations, I think people are a bit puzzled these days because there seems to be almost a lack of PTSD. Maybe explained by they're doing their duty, their professional unit. They feel it's legitimate somehow, even though the bigger political justification may be debated. They feel it's right when they are there. So when they go home, they don't end up like traumatized veterans, but they go back to their work as military and so on. So this is a case that really puzzles us. Is there something here that may explain why they don't seem to be traumatized, even though, and this has happened pretty often actually compared to Norwegian military history after the Second World War, where we were only exposed to warlike situations a few times, like in Lebanon in 78 and a bit in Somalia and so on. So many people have either killed or probably killed. So many means not that many, but in Norwegian terms, it's quite a few. and still it doesn't look like they're heavily traumatized.
If I may, I would pick up the first part of your comment. Thank you. Drug taking should be always analyzed in two contexts, like its set and setting, and this is exactly what you mentioned. But I would like to draw your attention to another yet aspect of drugs and war, which might be depressing even more, because the consumption of drugs and the addiction that arose from this activity, either prescribed or self-prescribed, was sometimes used by the politicians or elites, obviously in a kind of panic or exaggerated manner, to justify the introduction of state policies of control, anti-drug actions, etc., etc. So it worked on the false image created of the veteran who is addicted, getting back home and is threatening the society by spreading the addiction, criminal activities, etc., etc. And it's not only the Vietnam War, it's also the First World War and the morphine addiction. Look at the cocaine panic in Britain. The governments, exaggerated that, Germans were supplying cocaine to the British soldiers. That's why they were not winning, and the society was being, under the influence of cocaine, which was undermining the very greatness of Britain. Look back at the Civil War in the US and the so-called soldier's disease, which was completely false and mythical. And it went that, the huge army of veterans addicted to opiates, morphine and opium, were destroying the society. And apparently, nothing like this happened. I mean, there were many addicts among veterans, but it didn't translate into the social problem of narcomania. And this is different when you are using drugs and you are addicted, but it doesn't affect the whole society. When it was used just before 1914 to generate a general panic or rise the atmosphere of fear in order to justify the Harrison Act, the first federal act to put substances under control. And it's very interesting how politics often uses the outcomes of war or the aftermath of war, by the way, often designed or caused by the very government to justify its other actions. So, well, when we look at the general image of war or veteran, we should be skeptical, we should be critical, and we shouldn't buy in everything that we are shown or told. Because history and drugs in war can teach us this.
Thank you very much, each and one of you, and especially you, Lukas, for a very interesting introduction and a very good debate. And also thank you to the audience who had patience to sit here in almost 2 hours. And I hope to see as many of you as possible on Saturday when we move on to weed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.